trouble. Most of the wonderful women, the organizers, were from upper class. They had the financial means, they had the political context to organize a victorious campaign for enfranchisement. But one of their members was a Jewish woman, Selena Solomons. She felt that there was a whole group of women that were not being contacted, were not being listened to. And these were called the shop girls, because for the first time in history, women did not have to leave their father's home and go directly to their husband's home. They could work in the community if it was a job that was deemed acceptable, such as she could be a shop worker, she could be a seamstress, she could be a laundress. Anything that a woman could do in the home, she could do outside and be paid for. So Selena said, these women need to know about suffrage. They can reach a whole group of community that we can't. So she rented a loft space, which happened to be one of the cheaper loft spaces. It was in Union Square of San Francisco. I can't even imagine what it would cost now. But she created this loft space and invited the shop girls and her other members of the community to come together for soup, for salad, and for suffrage. They would come for the food, they would stay for the discussions because they were so hungry. They had a newfound freedom. They were eager to be part of the future of the society being created by them and for them. So that's the title where soup, salad, and suffrage comes. And I obviously can go on much more, but I just want to say this. The right to vote for women was won in California by only one vote per precinct. It won by the narrowest of margins. And so who could vote? Any woman who was a citizen of California. The Latinas, the Blacks, of course, the white. Who could not vote were the Chinese. Due to the immigration law that had been passed, they were not granted their citizenship until almost 40 years later. So an important question for us to ask as we celebrate this centennial is, who are the shop girls today? Who are the women working inside the home and outside the home who are often unacknowledged and yet who seem to know that their work is important? They need to know that their commitment to women's democracy is every bit as important as the women who are creating the policy. How can we invite these women to the table to eat and read and talk about matters that are important to them? Perhaps we could talk about what today represents. August 13th is the date that Black women have to work into the new year to finally reach pay equity from the previous year. In other words, Black women working full-time were only paid 62 cents for every dollar earned by men, meaning it takes over 7 additional months to reach equality. This is something that is important to all of us. This is necessary to all of us because it is a gender issue. It is a wage gap issue. So welcome to the first of 3 soup, salads, and suffrage democracy events. As you can see, voting rights were hard won, but we are not done. We are not done. And so I would like to use the words of Dolores Huerta and possibly Selena Solomons over. Also, pull up a chair to the table. And if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. So thank you and welcome, Protima.
Thank you, Sharon. And Shirley Chisholm's statement about bringing a folding chair is so appropriate. This is our folding chair. We're not going to let the pandemic stop us. And yes, today we're marking African-American Women's Equal Pay Day. And in November, people, we're going to mark Native American Women's Equal Pay Day. We have so much more work to do, but today we're going to pause and remember how far we've come. I want to now shift gears. Who's going to help us start off today? We have thought about what we want to do to create longevity in this work by honoring those who came before us and fought for the women's right to vote. As Sharon mentioned, not all of us got the right to vote 100 years ago. And as Sharon mentioned, together we will preserve this right to vote for our future. One such member of our future is who's going to help us get started. A high school student in Milpitas, Carrington. Carrington was someone I heard at the Women's March. I just gotten ready to say what I had to say, and Carrington came before me, and she blew me away. But I'll tell you what, when I walked on the stage, the first thought in my mind was, it's okay if you're not all that good, because the future is shiny. Shiny, bright, smart, intelligent, courageous fighter. That's who we're going to begin with. So I would request for Carrington's video to be played now. Thank you.
Hello and good morning, everyone. My name is Carrington Kenny, and as of today, I am a senior at Milpitas High School. So I was invited here today to talk a little bit about myself, what I'm trying to do, and how you can have a huge impact on my future. So to begin, I spoke up about an incident that had happened at my school on Halloween 2019. A teacher came to school in blackface, and I was one of the only students to speak up and say something out of 3,000 students. So from there, our school definitely became a little bit more racially aware. We definitely like to say that we're diverse at Milpitas High, but we don't really know that much about each other. So for something like this to happen, especially because it was a teacher and not even a student, it was a huge deal because he was able to go through 2 periods without anyone saying anything. And even after I had spoken up, obviously some people were going to say it was not a big deal, but it doesn't refer to them. It didn't have an impact on those people because they don't look like me. So at the end of the day, I had to do what I had to do. And I did a lot of interviews. I spoke out on TV about the incident. And for me, it really didn't matter what anyone else was going to say. It was about doing the right thing. And what he did was wrong. So I just needed to make it aware that we cannot let this stuff slide. So after a lot of people had seen this, the Vice Mayor, Karina Dominguez, reached out to me, and she said that I had really inspired her, and she offered me a spot to speak at the Women's March, in which I was one of the youngest people there. And that was my first time doing public speaking. And it was truthfully really amazing. I had people young and old come up to me and tell me that just me speaking was super inspirational to them. So I definitely hold that close to my heart. I knew I had impact on people, but that was my first time speaking, and just me putting everything that's in my head into words on paper and spoke out to people. It really, truly touched a lot of different souls out there, so it's truly amazing. Since then, I've spoken at 10 other events since January up until now. It's truly amazing. I've been on podcasts and also just outside events as well. And I've spoken at 2 different Black Lives Matter events, which is really amazing. And yeah, so as you all know, I am a senior as of today, so a lot of teenagers my age are trying to figure out what they want to do and who they want to be, and this year has been super eye-opening to me. I decided, I believe at the end of my sophomore year, that being a lawyer was definitely one of my top choices as a career. And I didn't quite know what type of lawyer, but I knew I wanted to help people. So I did a lot of research and I was pretty set on it. And then I actually saw the movie Just Mercy, and this was based on a true story that had happened. And I learned a little bit about a lawyer named Brian Stevenson, who has a lot of impact and is doing a lot in this country to help people. And he helped a man who was wrongfully convicted and was actually put on death row for a crime he did not commit. And seeing the journey and seeing how he was profiled and how everything went down it's really sad, and it's scary. And the fact that some people, actually a lot of people, are going through this right now, it doesn't sit right with me, and it shouldn't sit right with you either. So I was like, okay, well, it's set in stone now, because I can't let other people go through this. And although I do have a lot of other things I'm trying to do in my life, I mean, for me, that this is a huge thing. And it's not just a career, it's helping people so that they can go on and live their lives like I'm getting to do right now. So if it were me, I'd want someone to help. So I'm definitely fixating myself on making sure that no one else has to go through what these people are going through right now. And obviously it's going to take a lot of time, but I mean, my mindset is there. So that's what I'm hoping to do. And after seeing this movie, it was truly amazing. And I'm associated with the African American Community Service Agency, and they reached out to me to give me a couple tickets to give to my BSU to come see a private screening of it. And I got to bring 20 other students with me to go see this movie, and the writer of the movie was actually there, and we got to watch it with the 49ers. And I think it was a big experience because we had a lot of freshman boys come with us, and I think it had a big impact on them. And it's super important that we make sure that this is known, that this is happening in our country right now, because a lot of people are very disconnected in what's actually happening. So it was a big deal for me to make sure that at least my people at this school knew what was going on. And getting to speak with the writer, and I mean, watching with the 49ers was really amazing as well. And the writer was just basically talking about how he went to different prisons to speak with people to see how they're doing, to talk about their stories. And he was just talking about his impact and how it impacted him, and how he could make sure he portrays this movie correctly. And it really did. So if you haven't watched Just Mercy, I definitely recommend you watching that if you want to see a little bit more of a background on the career path I decided to take. But yeah, that's definitely something I'm trying to do. So now on to the part where you can have a big impact on my future. I'm only 17 years old, which means I cannot vote.
So Carrington is in school right now. This is what Carrington sent us this morning, even though today is her first day of school. And we wish she could have finished her statement, but look, what did she leave us with? She can't vote yet. And what do we have to do? What is our call to action? Our call to action is to remember how a young person spoke up against microaggression, how a young person brought to life in 2018 what was being done by somebody in a position of power. And today, we are gathered to find ways in which we need to use our voice to continue to secure the future for youth like Carrington. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to now introduce somebody who has championed the work of Office of Women's Policy tirelessly, who has demonstrated the tenacity required to find a platform that all of us could join her on, and who was instrumental in getting our Board of Supervisors to set up the Women's Equality Leadership Council in 2018, when the rest of the nation was not even paying attention to what was coming in 2020. President Chavez, who's the president of our Board of Supervisors, has agreed to welcome us all, and it is my absolute pleasure and honor to turn it over to President Cindy Chavez.
Thank you. This is the first event. I'm so excited. I hope all of you who are here are excited. And I'm going to be asking my staff to put a live link because I'm so excited to hear from Elisa and, of course, our own local hero, Michelle Dauber. And I know that Supervisor Cortese is going to have more to say. So I'm going to get right to it because I think people want to hear from you all. And I just, one note, I wanted to say thank you to the Office of Women's Policy. They have been amazing. They have not missed a beat. And to Sharon Buska and Peg and others who were really the inspiration for our celebration. It's just, I just want to say that we're a community made of women and men that I'm just so proud to be associated with. And there's no place in the whole world I'd rather be celebrating this than with all of you. So thank you. So it gives me great pleasure to get to introduce Elisa. And Elisa, I'm going to let you make sure I say your last name properly. Camhort Page, who will be moderating the first Soup, Salad, and Suffrage series kickoff. Yay! Everybody give her a big round of applause in your living rooms or wherever you're at right now. She is best known as the founding COO of BlogHer Inc. Elisa was there at the birth of the social web revolution, building a grassroots phenomenon into the national women's media brand with 100 million web users. I want you to think about 100 million web users and thousands of conference goers. After selling BlogHer and leaving the company, Elisa turned her attention to social and civic engagement in the wake of the 2016 election and becoming the co-author of Roadmap for Revolutionaries, Resistance, Activism, and Advocacy for All, and the host of a new podcast, The Op-Ed Page, with Elisa Camhort Page, which I think is so cool. Among her many accolades, Elisa has been named a social media legend by the C-Suite Network, a top women in media by Folio, and one of the Alliance of Women in Media's 60 at 60 honorees. As a member of the BlogHer founding team, Elisa and her colleagues were named among the most powerful women entrepreneurs by Fortune, the most powerful women in news, new media by Forbes, and the most influential women in technology by Fast Company. I have no idea how she has time to be with us today because she is so influential. Elisa lives in San Jose, and we are blessed to have her here with her spouse and her cats, and dedicated to helping people figure out how to operate at the intersection of technology, media, inclusivity, and social impact. Please give a warm welcome and a drum roll to Elisa. Thank you for moderating this series. We're so excited to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I've actually been working with the Leadership Council as a volunteer for a while now, dialing in, and the shift that happened when the pandemic hit and how everything just turned on a dime. I just wanted to reiterate how impressive this group of women are who decided to keep going and to make as much impact as possible, even in this new kind of reality. So I am thrilled to be able to contribute in this way and participate in the entire series. And I'm very excited to talk with Michelle, who I've known since, in fact, I hosted an event with her in my home back during the original Persky initiative, recall initiative. So I'm very excited to speak further with her. To learn a little bit more about Michelle, I'm going to introduce Supervisor Dave Cortese. He's been a public servant here for many years, first as Eastside Union High School District Trustee, Vice Mayor and City Councilperson in San Jose, and now he represents District 3 on the County Board of Supervisors. So let's hear from Dave.
Well, thank you so much. It is very, very much an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Michelle Dauber as part of this program today. She has permanently shaped how our country responds to sexual violence, how we stand with survivors, how we should and must stand with survivors. And she has let women across the country, not just locally, know that if they speak up, we'll stand with them. That wasn't easy. And it wasn't something that just started with the beginning of a recall campaign. That is the culmination of a long story, and I hope Michelle has a chance to touch upon her own history a little bit in her comments. But going back, for example, to 2011, 2013, Professor Michelle Dauber at Stanford co-chaired the Board on Judicial Affairs, where she led revising Stanford's policy on sexual assault and bringing it into compliance with Title IX. 2011 through 2013. The recall was June 2018. And so it just gives you an idea of the years of effort and sacrifice that started well before then, and the great work that she was doing even in 2011 and 2013. I look back on it now, and what were, for me, and I'm sure most of you, very disturbing allegations against another legal appointee, another judge seeking a Supreme Court position, Judge Kavanaugh. When those very disturbing allegations arose, and another Stanford professor made national media attention by speaking up. I don't know about how many of you, but what occurred to me real time at that time was that Michelle Dauber had set the stage, had created the transformational change, the mindset, so that that kind of courage could be exhibited on perhaps even a larger stage. Thank you so much, Michelle, for doing that. And again, just to keep those dates in perspective, the sexual assault, which drew Michelle Dauber's attention in a women's movement that became known as Enough is Enough, consisting of hundreds and hundreds of young women, diverse women, who came together to say enough is enough. They started to address a sexual assault that occurred in 2015. Eventually ran a campaign to recall a judge for the first time in 80 years in the state of California. Not just to recall him by the thin margin of a contested, highly contentious campaign, but by 62% of the vote. But what I really want to say about all of that, and I'll try to conclude those comments, is for those of us who have run campaigns, Supervisor Chavez and I have the battle scars to talk about. Michelle Dauber literally put her own physical, mental, and personal well-being on the front lines to make sure that justice was served. She didn't just run a campaign. Her reputation was attacked. Her family was attacked. She was attacked in every possible way that a public figure could possibly be attacked. And she had just emerged as a public figure. I can't probably explain to anyone who hasn't been in a similar situation, and I've only been in a somewhat similar position because I've been on the campaign side. I cannot possibly explain how traumatizing that kind of work and that kind of effort is, and how painful that can be. To have Michelle Dauber here live, real time, to stand before us as a survivor herself of a political system that's no holds barred, especially when it comes to standing up for women's rights, I think is just an amazing thing, and almost a sort of miracle in and of itself, that you're here with us, Michelle, to tell the story and to continue the movement. Let me just do the formal thing very quickly because it's important. She's received numerous distinguished book awards and prizes from the American Historical Association, the American Sociological Association, the American Political Science Association, the American Society for Legal History, the Law and Society Association. She is also the recipient of the 2006 Walter J. Gorse Award from Stanford University's, which is Stanford University's highest teaching honor. And from 2016 to 2017, she served on the California State Task Force on Sexual Harassment. I mentioned the pain that she went through, even suffering attacks from people who had been and would have been traditionally her friends and allies. But most importantly about her story is something else I want to share as an observation after almost 20 years in public service. Rarely do you get the opportunity to make permanent, permanent, and I emphasize permanent, transformational change to the world. Michelle Dauber had that opportunity, seized that opportunity, and accomplished that. And that is a very, very rare thing. I wish we could give her a standing ovation on Zoom, but how about a virtual standing ovation for Michelle Dauber? Thank you so much for what you've done.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Supervisor Cortese, and I'm really grateful to the Office of Women's Policy and all of the many people who have contributed to this event. It's a great honor to be here, and it's a great honor to have the opportunity to speak with Elisa, who's someone I admire greatly, and with all of you. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Supervisor Cortese, for that great introduction. And to kick off with Michelle, I would actually, inspired by Carrington, who we just heard describe what drew her to the law, you know, my first question is really to go back and understand what drew you to the law, and to helping others learn about the law and their rights and how to engage with the Constitution. And you had to engage with the California Constitution for your effort around recalling Judge Persky. So what is your story about connecting to the law?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was also very impressed with Carrington, and was thinking about some of my former students that I can connect her with. So I actually come from a background as a community and union organizer. And so I was already really committed to working on issues that affected poor and marginalized communities, people who are often denied opportunities. And I came to understand, well, I got very interested in people being denied, you know, their rights, and as enumerated in the Constitution. Over time, I'm sorry to say that I have come to understand rights as illusory for people who lack power. And this category usually includes women, even women who are in some respects quite privileged in relation to others. So the Constitution is something that looms large for most people. It's almost a quasi-religious document in the United States. But the truth is that from my perspective today, it is full of broken promises and ideals that are not realized for most people most of the time. The legal system is held up as a way to vindicate your rights. And of course, rights are a somewhat abstract concept. And the fact is that to utilize the legal system requires itself a lot of resources. Most people lack access to justice because they lack those resources. And the legal system primarily exists to serve the interests of people who already have power and already have resources. So mostly I consider the Constitution to be symbolic most of the time. Don't get me wrong, because symbolism matters. The fact that you have a right to be treated in a certain way can motivate people to take other actions. And it's those other actions that interest me most. Protest, voting, campaigning, organizing, as a way to get access to power and to change the system. But having rights on paper is not the same thing as having them in reality. One thing that the Constitution does, however, that's very real and very accessible, is that it establishes the rules for voting. And voting is how, in a democracy, power is redistributed. And so democracy really interests me as a practice, not just as a theory, because unlike suing and going to court and being stuck there potentially for years, voting can be a more accessible way of gaining access to collective power. And I think that is, you know, sort of a very roundabout way of saying that I got very interested in the law as a way to help people, and over time learned that law is a poor tool as compared to voting, organizing, and protesting.
Well, there is a lot to unpack in that statement, and we're going to actually dig into different elements of it in this conversation. But let's actually set the table a bit first about the 19th Amendment. I hope I'm not the only person, certainly not in my age range, who mostly knows about it from a Schoolhouse Rock jingle, which paints a particularly triumphant view of the 19th Amendment striking down that outdated rule. I think that's how it goes. But paint a picture for us of what was actually a years-long effort, and what kind of, there was literal blood, sweat, and tears that were shed to earn this right. As Protima said, it was fought for. So can you paint us a picture a little bit about how long it took and what that process was like?
Absolutely. So there's a lot we could talk about on the subject of women's suffrage. For today, for this discussion, I really thought of three sort of big points that I want to focus on over the course of our discussion about women's suffrage in the United States. And as you just mentioned, Elisa, it was a long movement in our country with a long history. So the US women's suffrage movement is generally traced to the 1848 convention, which was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And it was a movement for the vote for white women primarily. And the convention was attended by white women, by a handful of white men, and by one Black person, Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist leader, likely because the women leaders, the white women leaders of the women's suffrage movement were also abolitionists. Remember, this is 1848, so it's pre-Civil War. And so they had a history with Mr. Douglass. Significantly, there were no Black women, however, at the convention. And it took from 1848, if we accept that date as the start of the women's suffrage movement, until 1920 to achieve more than 70 years. So that's one point. This is a long movement. And I think that's important to recognize, because many social movements, we get this sort of, as you said, sort of jingle version in which we think, that we can do something quickly, but most movements are quite long. Second, the second big point I'd like to focus on is that it was the women who fought for suffrage were subjected to extremely violent suppression. They were arrested, they were beaten, they were tortured, they were raped, they were imprisoned, they were sent to forced labor, they were subjected to forced feeding when they went on hunger strikes. This was not, simply going to a march. These women fought and died for the right to vote. Lives and families were destroyed. And third, like a lot of political movements, there was a lot of intra-movement conflict and compromises with conservative groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other groups who were quite openly racist. And ultimately, the women's suffrage movement sided with racist women's organizations in order to obtain the vote for white women, and sidelined and sold out women of color in order to get the vote for white women. And so I hope those are all topics that we can explore.
So you've already cleared up some myths about the 19th Amendment. One of the interesting things I think was mentioned before we even started, which is that some states already had the vote for women before the 19th Amendment passed. To me, this is very much a story of why your local and state vote matters so much, no matter what's happening at the federal level. But about the 19th Amendment specifically, it did not result in only white women voting, but neither did it result, as you point out, in all women voting. And it was a very incomplete victory. And to this day, it was another 70 years really before even constitutionally most women were cited specifically or made citizens and given the rights specifically at the constitutional level. So can you give us a sense let's talk a little bit more about that divide and conquer strategy. Mm-hmm. I believe, there's a divide and conquer strategy employed by those who already have power to dilute, generally speaking, but it was most specifically used both after the 14th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. It was, I think, a very specific strategy employed to dilute the power you know, of folks looking for suffrage and looking for the vote. And can you dig a little bit more into that?
Yes, absolutely. So the women's suffrage movement started out as part actually of a Black-white coalition over universal suffrage for all women and all Black people. I said this was at about the mid-19th century. However, the coalition split over the issue of the 15th Amendment, which would provide the vote only to Black men and not to women, whether Black or white. And this created tremendous friction within the suffrage movement that never really healed, even to this day. So according to historians Midge Wilson and Kathy Russell, Susan B. Anthony bitterly declared during the run-up to the 15th Amendment that she would, quote, cut off her right arm before campaigning for Black men to have the vote before white women. And this racism, which was quite open, split the suffrage movement into two camps. One was seeking the vote for white women only, and the other was supporting the 15th Amendment and also suffrage for women, whether Black or white. However, by the end of the 19th century, these two factions reunited, and most white women had decided to exclude Black women for reasons of racism, political expediency, or both. After the passage of the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction in approximately 1870, Black women wanted the vote that Black men were now sometimes able to have. Now remember, during the immediate Reconstruction period prior to the adoption of Black codes across the South, you know, things such as poll taxes and literacy tests and other things that were intended to exclude Black men from voting, there was a brief period where Black men were allowed to vote, and Black people were even elected in some cases to Congress. And I think there were 2 Black senators even during this time. So there was this window, and Black women also wanted the vote. Often they hoped that the vote would protect them from sexual abuse by white men, to which they were constantly subjected with complete impunity in the South and in the North as well. So according to historian Sharon Harley, Black suffragist Nannie Helen Burroughs responded to a white woman asking her about what would Black women do with the ballot, and said that, quote, the Black woman feels that she needs the ballot to reckon with men who place no value upon her virtue. So even then, at that early moment, women, particularly African-American women, felt that this was a ticket or a way that they could exercise some power and protect themselves from rape. And in fact, if you could now show the first photo, I have some photos included. Is it possible to do the screen share? There we go. There we go. This is a photo of Ida B. Wells, of whom you may have heard. African-American women continued to join with mixed success in the movement for women's suffrage. So Mary Church Terrell, who's a very famous African-American woman, spoke at the 1898 National Women's Suffrage Convention. Ida B. Wells, who's pictured here, is a very famous journalist and anti-lynching activist, and she was also a strong advocate for women's suffrage and tried to join the campaign, but was ultimately shunted aside. And if you could show the next slide. Next slide. Next one. There we go. Some Black women, in fact, due to the rejection that they were experiencing from white women's suffrage organizations, formed their own suffrage organizations. As the long movement dragged on for women's suffrage, leaders began to make compromises and coalitions, essentially with white supremacists, such as I mentioned, Frances Willard, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, that further marginalized and excluded Black women from the suffrage movement. Willard was at the time seen as perhaps the most powerful woman political leader in the world, and exemplified the feelings of white women speaking at the turn of the century, and criticized Ida B. Wells's crusade to stop lynching and ensure the vote for Black people, including Black women. Willard said, quote, "It is not fair that a plantation Negro who can neither read nor write should be entrusted with the ballot." I apologize if that's an upsetting sentence to hear, but this is the kind of discrimination that women, Black women who wanted to vote, were being subjected to by their supposed allies in the suffrage movement. And the increasing desperation of white women to secure the vote as the movement sort of grinded on for decades, and the role of racism came to a head in the 1913 National March for Suffrage. So if you could show the next slide. So in 1913, the women's suffrage movement, which again was a primarily white movement, decided that it was time to hold a big march. Now, Woodrow Wilson had just been elected. This was literally the eve of his inauguration, and they decided to have a huge march. And I believe there were something like 8,000 marchers ultimately. And it relied on imagery of white women as icons of innocence or justice. So this photo is of a woman dressed in an allegorical role. I think this is Joan of Arc on a horse. And the march was organized by a feminist leader named Alice Paul. Alice Paul was a Quaker and had both a law degree and a PhD in sociology, incidentally, the same degrees that I have. And she had been engaged in political organizing on behalf of women, as she had been beaten and jailed in England. In her activism for suffrage there, she had founded the Woman's Party, and she was incredibly brave and focused and determined. And by 1913, 60 years into the campaign, Alice Paul took it over and decided that more protest tactics were going to be necessary. And she started to organize marches and other activities that were modeled on the sort of militant feminism that was successful in getting the vote for women in England. Next photo, please. Next photo. Oh, there we go. So this is a protest to get Alice Paul out of prison. Back one, please. Alice Paul had been arrested, and they held a protest outside the White House to try to get her out of prison. She was a rigorous practitioner of nonviolence and was repeatedly jailed, beaten, sent to forced labor, abused, tortured, both in England and in the United States, actually. And she was a political prisoner at this time. So next photo. So in 1913, so women who protested for suffrage often faced quite serious violence, and Paul knew that, and she strategically used it, similarly actually to how it was utilized in Birmingham during the voting rights struggle for African American voting rights, where situations were set up where it was pretty clear that the authorities would react with violence, and then the movement was able to mobilize and use images of that violence in order to further the movement goals. And so Paul sort of cannily utilized the violence that occurred during the 1913 march in order to show the brutality and despicable conduct of opponents of women's suffrage. And this is a headline from a newspaper where she's doing just that. Ultimately, Paul was able to force a congressional inquiry into the role of police violence against the marchers. So if that has echoes today, that is, an interesting fact. So the march was being held on the eve of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a white supremacist, and he was a segregationist and a Southerner. And so there was concern that if the march was integrated, that it would just simply cause problems within the movement, and Wilson would not be persuaded. I mean, the idea was to show a unified front to Woodrow Wilson, and integration would not help that cause, according to the white women in the leadership role. And so, wary of offending Wilson and sort of desperate to get women's suffrage, Alice Paul decided to segregate the march. And I think this is a true black mark on her record, for which history rightly judges her. And Paul and the National Women's Suffrage Association betrayed Ida Wells and betrayed Black suffragists. Wells had brought her Black Alpha Suffrage Club to Chicago to the march. And according to historians, Paul segregated the march and said that Wells had to march at the back with her club. And Mary Church Terrell did, in fact, agree to march in the segregated section for African-American marchers, but Ida Wells snuck through the crowd, waited for the Illinois delegation to walk by, and then jumped to the front of the Illinois delegation and marched with the delegation and refused to march with these segregated groups. Alice Paul did this for nothing, basically, because Wilson resisted her pressure campaign anyway, refused to support the 19th Amendment until many years later. And so she got basically very little for it. But she was right to worry about a coming backlash from racists. So by 1919, she had successfully organized a drive to bring the 19th Amendment to a vote in Congress, but now that vote had become deeply entwined with debates over race. Southern racist Democrats who controlled the Senate at that time and controlled it until after Lyndon Johnson came to power. So, for many, many more years, they wanted to repeal the 15th Amendment and take away voting rights from Black men. And they certainly didn't want to extend voting rights for Black people from men to women. That is the opposite of what they wanted to do. And historian Lillette Gidlow has shown that Black women understood that their right to vote required both the 15th and the 19th Amendment, and that both would have to be vigorously defended by the federal government in a South that was opposed to Black voting, where Black women would face poll taxes and literacy tests and the other elements of the Black Code to which Black men were then being subjected. So Black women suffragists were desperate for the help and support of the white women that they had been fighting alongside to make common cause with them and defend both the 15th and 19th Amendment. And white suffragists also understood this, but instead of joining with Black women, they decided to abandon them. And they worked to unite white women for women's suffrage. And Black women were left to the predations of the South for another 1920 to say, 1970, another 50 years. And that really is to the great shame of the women's suffrage movement, and one from which I think we have not yet recovered.
I was struck when we spoke about this idea of abolition versus incrementalism. I think that is a common divide in many justice movements. I mentioned, as a side note, I'm a vegan who's also interested in animal rights and the whole animal welfare versus animal rights, like this idea of get some incremental successes until you can get to the full weight of what you really want. But in this case, women of color were literally left behind when, and the parade, and then literally left behind with being unable to vote in many, many, many parts of the country. And it went on for 50 years. How are the effects of both those internal conflicts and the external conflicts? They seem very relevant to this day in justice movements. They seem very relevant today in discussions of feminists. There's just been renewed looks at some of the typical feminist organizations that have been around, maybe the second wave feminist organizations from the 70s and even some earlier. And they're, really problematic issues around race that persist. Where are you seeing that happen today, and how is it holding us back, really, to not finally try to resolve and repair?
Yeah, this is exactly the issue that I was trying to get at with Alice Paul's decision to knuckle under to racism and white supremacy. Alice Paul was probably not a virulent racist. She was a Quaker. She had worked with, across racial boundaries with many, many groups. She was said to be a friend of Ida Wells. But she made a tactical decision to leave Black women behind, potentially temporarily, until she could get the vote for white women, with the idea that this would be an incremental victory. And then once the goal was achieved, white women would, in some mythical universe, insist that women of color in the South be given the effective right to vote. But the problem with incremental justice is that often tomorrow never comes.
Right.
And this is what happened in the case of women's suffrage. Black women didn't get the right to vote till many years later. It's also what happened in the case of unemployment. Franklin Roosevelt made compromises with the very same Southern racists who controlled the Senate in order to get the Social Security Act passed on the condition that essentially agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from it, and that included functionally all African-American people in the South. So these kinds of compromises, Faustian bargains, people have fantasies that, someday we'll just get there little by little, but someday never comes because, the white women got theirs and they went home and quickly forgot about the people who they had betrayed and left behind. And of course, I think we can still see this today in the Me Too movement, which is the movement that I'm, most perhaps, personally associated with. The treatment of Black women was not really front and center in the Me Too movement, and other women of color. In the beginning, it was white women movie stars and white college girls, even though we know that women of color and disabled women and trans individuals are much more likely to be subjected to these kinds of sexual abuses. Their stories were not front and center. And Black women had to fight to get the story of R. Kelly out. Black women had to fight to get the story of Russell Simmons out. It has been a fight from, looking for white allies and not finding them when they needed them. One of my good friends is one of the survivors of Russell Simmons, and had faced a lot of difficulty in bringing forward her story. And I really recommend people see the film On the Record, which is out and available and streaming now. It's an incredible film, and those African-American women who came forward showed real courage in doing that and looked for support both in their own community and in the white community, and didn't necessarily find it. So I think that we need to believe Black women, we need to believe Black girls, we need to fight as hard, if not harder, for justice and fair treatment for the most marginalized groups. One of the things that was most frustrating to me during the recall campaign that was referenced earlier is that, Brock Turner was a white individual who received a light sentence for sexually assaulting a woman of color. And of course, that fact was not public, but I knew it, and Judge Persky knew it, and the people defending Judge Persky knew it. Asian women have been fetishized and sexualized and not respected and not given their rights to bodily autonomy, for, a long, long time in this country. And, there is a real history of that, particularly here in California, that we need to be cognizant of and aware of. And we need to work as white women who enjoy privilege to lift up and help and be allies and support women of color, rather than taking what we want and leaving them to, experience the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for, exploring that more. I do want to talk about what power protests do have. I think one of the points of my book that Supervisor Chavez mentioned, Roadmap for Revolutionaries, is that activism and advocacy can be in a lot of different places. Your workplace, your dollar, how you spend your dollar, the media, mentioning On the Record, and there's Surviving R. Kelly. There's great investigative media. And then, but our first chapter is about protest and civil disobedience. And obviously the suffrage movement included that for years. But you said some really interesting things when we spoke before this about what kinds of protests are really about driving change versus building awareness, and where protest matters and where the power of your vote, you know, becomes specifically the most important thing you can do. So talk a little bit about the kind of protest, the kind of civic action you think drives real change and therefore gets different reaction. I thought that was some really interesting stuff we discussed.
Yeah. So most protests fail because they don't produce conditions that force people in power to make change. And there are some exceptions, but they're relatively few. I mean, I'm not against protests. I've been to plenty, I've led some, but they need to be backed up by something that is more powerful than just a protest. Now, often that is winning elections. And of course, the example that I'm, you know, sort of most fond of is the recall of Judge Persky because of his lenient sentencing of Brock Turner and other privileged abusers. There were a lot of protests and petitions after that verdict. There were change.org petitions, there were marches, there were protests, but there weren't any real threat to Judge Persky because, you know, nothing was affecting, you know, his situation. And there, in fact, he even said it during one of the interviews that he gave to the media. Right before the election, Judge Persky, former Judge Persky, said that he had expected some protests. He said, I expected people to be upset. I expected there to be some protests, but quote, not this. This went too far to vote. He didn't think women should be able to utilize the franchise and vote to hold him accountable. So I am in agreement, you know, with President Obama, who said, don't boo, vote. And that is sort of my watchword, you know, like, I think it's great to protest, but you need to have a means to hold power accountable or, you know, protests come and go, you know, and the system is set up to allow that to happen. They even have free speech zones and, you know, whole methods and mechanisms of containing protest. And so, you know, it was as if Aaron Persky had said, well, you know, there'll probably be some protests and it'll pass. And then, you know, I'll go on giving lenient sentences to sex offenders, you know, of privilege after that's over. And nothing will change. The status quo will carry on. And I think that that's why strategic use of voting is a way of interrupting the status quo and can, in fact, bring it to its knees.
You
yeah,
leveraged something in the California Constitution that hadn't been used, as Supervisor Cortese said, in 80 years. And I used to get that pushback at the time, people would say this will scare judges into not making the right call because they'll be afraid of being recalled. And I'm like, well, I hardly think they're going to be scared of something that the populace hasn't enacted in 80 years. But my other point always was, if it's in the Constitution, why is it there if we're never going to exercise it? Like, what's it there for otherwise? And it brings up the interesting thing you said at the very outset, which is that in some ways our Constitution is symbolic and that our rights are theoretical. And that your real power is going to come from exercising your vote and putting people in power who are maybe more likely to respect our rights in real time. And that was another thing that we talked at length about, that this is why the fight for the vote is still so important, because that's where, like you said, change really happens. So I would like to take us down that path a little bit, which I warn you ahead of time is we found a little depressing, talking about how our constitutional rights are theoretical, but I swear we're going to bring it around to like the hopeful future action. But I mean, expand on that a little bit. Why are our rights theoretical, and how are we seeing that right now in what's happening? You know, Portland is perhaps the most obvious current example, but what do you mean by that? Our rights are theoretical.
Well, Rights are not self-executing, right? The fact that the Constitution says you have, a First Amendment right to protest, that's not necessarily a self-executing right. I mean, there's no rights police who jump out from the bushes and, in order to protect you when the police start firing pepper balls, right? You have to experience the suppression or denial of that right and then go to court and try to vindicate it, a years-long process that mostly leaves people empty-handed. So the same is true of the right not to experience sexual harassment in the workplace. I think this is the example that many women are most familiar with. You receive a handbook when you get a job, and it says you have the right not to experience sexual harassment, and if you complain, you have the right not to experience retaliation, and that plus $5 will get you a cup of coffee. You aren't, what do you do when the sexual harassment happens? The anti-sexual harassment police do not come and stop the person from violating your rights. You have to hire an attorney. That means you have to have money. You have to be able to take time off work to go meet with your attorney. That means you have to be a person of relative privilege. And there are all these barriers to accessing justice and enforcing your rights. And of course, the poorer you are, the less likely that is to occur. So that's what I mean by rights are theoretical. I think that, just to, sort of circle back to the question of, sort of voting versus protest, if you could show, I think I have one more photo. Protest, as I said, that's a tool to an end. It's not an end in itself, in my opinion. And the goal is to educate and motivate people to take action after the protest by bringing them together into a group that has meaning beyond the event. So enacting change means focusing on what happens after. And so what if all the people who have gone out and protested against Donald Trump actually showed up to vote against him? And I think that is the sort of, that's the key, thing, right? We have these theoretical rights that are being violated. We can go out and protest against them. The system is well equipped to ignore your protests. It doesn't care. And what it actually cares about is the kind of accountability that you can generate at the ballot box, which is of course why people in power have tried to suppress the voting rights of, poor people, minorities, and women.
They wouldn't work so hard to suppress it if it wasn't important. I always, to your point about protesting against Trump, I always bring up that in January of 2017, Los Angeles had the biggest women's march, 750,000 people, and they had an election later that month in January. That was a local election, but it was electing some school board people, including some that were sort of the Betsy DeVos mindset, and they had something like 17% turnout. And I always think people get so obsessed with the federal elections, which that's obviously very important, but voter suppression mostly is a state enacted government action. Gerrymandering happens at the state level. Many, many things happen at our local and state levels. All those school boards no one was showing up to vote for, they're making decisions right now about how kids are going back to school, or if they are and how they are. They make decisions about dress codes that are often fundamentally sexist and racist. I mean, these local issues are so important, and I think people really lose sight of the power of voting at that level as well. Not to mention, it provides the pipeline to later statewide and national office. And that's something that, we wonder how we end up with the candidates we end up with on any side of the aisle. And well, a lot of times it's because they've come up through the ranks on elections that a lot of us don't research or even show up for. So it's such a, it's an expansive problem, but again, like they wouldn't work so hard to suppress it if it didn't have the power, right?
Right. And I just to circle back on something that I think is important to note, you mentioned, I think critically, that California got the vote for women 9 years before the rest of the country in 1911. The California Constitution was amended to add two things in 1911. This is just a side note. The right to recall judges and the vote for women. And in 1913, the women of San Francisco rose up and recalled a judge in an almost identical situation to the Aaron Persky situation, a judge named Charles Weller. Their slogan was "All's well that ends weller," and it was the women suffragists in the League of San Francisco that led that recall campaign. He had been extremely lenient to the son of a prominent businessman who had allegedly committed several sexual assaults in Golden Gate Park of girls. And that was, in fact, an almost carbon copy of the campaign that happened here in Santa Clara County 80 years later. So I think that, more than 80 years later, nearly 100 years later. So I think that, you know, these kinds of corrections by women utilizing the vote in order to make a stand about the importance and seriousness of sexual violence are important ways of moving the Overton window, essentially, on what is possible and what is acceptable. Sometimes I had a good friend who lived in Palo Alto, who was like you know, having these conversations with people who were against the recall. And she just looked at them and said, you know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And I think this is why having our right to vote, utilizing our right to vote strategically and ensuring that we are participating in the process at all points is so important, because this is the language of power in a democracy. Voting is the language of power in a democracy. They are ready to hear you cry and whine and complain and, you know, say, I'm sad, you know, Brock Turner got 6 months, you know, the system is perfectly established to ignore that. Oh, police violence, oh, it's so terrible. They are perfectly set up to ignore whatever the complaint is and say, you know, oh, our heart goes out to you, thoughts and prayers, you know, whatever it is. They're set up for that. What they're not set up for is we're taking over. And that's what the vote allows you to do. And so I'm very pleased to have done my little part in that regard. And I am hoping that other people will be wanting to, you know, continue that kind of movement.
Well, I think we see that, if I can turn it to where I at least see hope, despite our rights sometimes being trampled, despite turnout needing to be amped up. What I think we have seen in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years is a kind of, I think I was quoted in the Mercury saying that protests don't work when the people being protested have no shame. And right. I think that, to your point, people are figuring out when the people they're protesting have no shame, and they are turning out more. If we look at the midterms in 2018, if we look at really how elections have been going and the drive of women voters, the drive of voters from previously underrepresented communities or marginalized communities, the African-American vote, the Latino vote, the LGBT vote, all of these folks, you know, I think that they are driving change in the people who are going to be representing them to enact. So one thing I have found really fascinating about our current protest since the murder of George Floyd is that actually small things have been happening at the local level in places around the country. It's small, but it's happening by elected officials who I think are seeing what's happening in their own very local area. Minneapolis, Louisville passed the law to stop no-knock warrants, which is what killed Breonna Taylor. These are small, these are localized, they're very relevant to what the people in that locality are actually protesting. And those are people who feel, I think the people passing these local laws are people who feel very much that they can be voted out, that if people mobilize. So maybe the first step is showing mobilization on the street, and then you got to take your feet over to the voting booth. And the thing I'm always advocating for is you got to take it to every single time you have the chance, the local election, the county election, the state election. Like, there's a lot of decision making that happens because of that kind of connecting of the dots.
Agree. And I think one of the things that I have found the most encouraging is the young women of color who have young progressive women of color who are not willing to continue to settle for half a loaf, who want to disrupt the status quo and who are starting to run for office.
Yeah.
I think that like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the group of women who were, you know, called the Squad in Congress, and then also in local elections, we're seeing more and more of these very progressive young women who see the importance of not just protesting, but taking that and turning it into the concrete exercise of voting rights. You know, John Lewis, you know, it's almost cliche to talk about John Lewis now because of all of the, you know, great, you know, praise that he's so rightly receiving on his sad and unfortunate passing. But he was a hero of mine, was Robert Moses, and who helped, not the Robert Moses of New York City, but the one who organized voting rights in the South. And, you know, I think that the subversive nature of what Alice Paul and then later Bob Moses and John Lewis and the other voting rights campaigners, Diane Nash and others in the South did, the subversive nature, you know, looks very, it's a beautiful thing because it looks very like, hey, we just want the right to vote, but it's incredibly subversive because it has the power to change the entirety of the situation and disrupt the status quo. And I think people in this country, I mean, the low rates of voting in this country, the low rates of exercise of the franchise, you know, something that people literally got their heads beaten in for, both these white women that we were talking about today, the Black women who tried very hard to fight alongside them, and the African Americans who later in the South, along with some white allies, were willing to be beaten and killed and jailed in order to achieve the right to vote. I mean, the idea that that right to vote is taken for granted, I find shocking. I mean, I just find it absolutely shocking.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think there's something also to be said for the way there will always be people who make way, who are, so you brought up Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, and a lot of people will bring up, well, she just lives in the most incredibly blue district. And that may be true. And as I think Nancy
Pelosi, well, she had to beat somebody though.
Yes, and as Nancy Pelosi has said the same about her district, right? These are incredibly blue districts that the Democrat doesn't really feel at risk. But the existence of AOC starts to roll, I think, out those districts which are safe for whatever, you know, the sort of most progressive in this case. It starts to normalize perspectives and point of views. Now, we see that actually on both sides of the spectrum. I mean, someone's going to go to Congress who's a QAnon conspiracy theorist.
Oh my God. I read
so,
about that.
So if you care about which side of the spectrum is going to get normalized and rolled out and sort of soften the way, and you're in one of those districts, I mean, this is something really to think about. If you're in a district that, or in a locality, you know, that can be making the way for someone who is more strongly in the direction you want to go, that actually starts to roll outwards from it. And I think that's how these things matter as well, because you start to, I mean, when I think about things that are in the national conversation now that were not 5 years ago, whether it's defund the police, whether it's, you know, getting back to the universal healthcare conversation and trying to move that forward, you know, many things that are now normalized to be national conversation pieces, and everybody's got to have a position on it. That's what marriage equality went through, a phase like that, where it began to be, I like to think here in California, we had a big role in normalizing that and pushing folks to have to take a more progressive position on it. And it starts somewhere where there's fertile ground for that. You look like you don't necessarily agree with me, but.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I just am remembering Prop 8. And so, you know, we had, I mean, yes. I think that we had a shock, you know, when we learned who our fellow Californians actually were. And then we had to rise up and utilize the vote in order to transform that situation. And I feel that you are, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think that's a statement about the cycles of shock, really, right? That we started doing things in San Francisco that caused some folks on the right to rise up and push Prop 8 through, which caused a bigger response. I mean, like, I guess that's, seems like we only are motivated by the shock of understanding that not everyone agrees with us and we have to fight for what we believe in. And maybe that's, at the end of the day, the ballot box is where that happens. And maybe that is our cycle.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. The ballot box is where it happens. That's where change happens. You know, I think there is, I think that marching is really important, but it's really important to remember that these people were marching for voting rights. Mm-hmm. And they wanted, you know, marching for voting rights means they wanted to vote. And the reason they wanted to vote was because they wanted to seize power. And again, the system is set up perfectly for people to say, you know, I'm having a protest against anti-gay discrimination, which is really important. That's very different than we have collected enough signatures to put it on the ballot in order to ensure gay and LGBT and trans equality. Right? And now we're going to vote, right? You say you're against it. I say I'm for it. Now we're going to take a poll, right? We're going to find out because we're going to vote. And that's, I think, you know, the other thing that an election using, like, say, the initiative process to put like a recall or a proposition on the ballot, one of the things that's great about that is it gives you an opportunity to go out and knock on doors and talk to people one-on-one and try to persuade them to your view that you don't have, like, if you're just having a march, right? Like, one of the reasons that we pursued this strategy, the electoral strategy with the recall, and one of the reasons that I think it was a good strategy and subversive is that by collecting signatures, we had the opportunity to talk with voters and try to, you know, hi, can I talk to you about campus sexual assault and the Brock Turner case? I'm sure you've heard of Brock Turner. You know, we had the chance to go out one-on-one and do a huge amount of education door to door in this county, back when you could go door to door, and persuade people, hey, this is a really important issue that really matters. And it's happening right now in your community, and you're going to have the chance to vote on it. And let me tell you why I think you should vote this particular way. That was a huge amount of education through just the signature collection process. We collected, instead of 58,000 signatures, nearly 100,000, because that education process then paved the way for the vote when we got a second round of going out and talking one-on-one with voters and having forums. My perspective on the recall was, of course, I wanted to win. I'm a very competitive person. I'm a big political organizer. I like winning. Winning is good. But my feeling about it was, you know, this is a win, even if we lose the vote, because we have had 2 solid years of community education on the issue of campus sexual violence and sexual violence generally. And that is going to change our community in Santa Clara County. And I think it has changed our community in Santa Clara County. Just all of that one-on-one voter contact. There's 1 million registered voters. You know, we knocked on thousands, tens of thousands of doors. We, you know, we sent, 500,000 pieces of mail 6 times, you know, like, there was a huge community education effort. And that is the same with any issue. If you want to defund the police, put it, you know, and you put it on the ballot and you collect signatures to put defund the police on the ballot. And then you get to go out and go door to door and talk to people about that issue and about how they feel about it, and spend time educating voters on your issue and then turning them out to vote. I mean, it focuses you in a way that just having protests does not focus you on achieving a tangible goal. So that's why I like it myself, but, you know, there could be other perspectives.
No, I mean, I think that I do think that they go hand in hand, but I do think there's a sequence, you know, there's, to really enact change, there's a sequence to it, you know. I know that
I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying,
of course,
like, vote.
Yes, then there's the next step, right? So I know that we have a couple of questions, so I think we have time for 1 or 2. I'm not sure who was collecting those.
Yes, Alicia,
Okay.
I am curating the questions. Thank you. You know, I'm reminded of something you said about the local actions. The late John Lewis in his parting obituary, in his parting editorial, our very own co-chair Sharon Buska has been quoting and I paraphrase, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And that's why local elections matter as well. So thank you. The question I wanted to ask was from an attendee who asked, in daily action, what does lift up mean? What are the specific actions that we can take? I think many just feel like they don't know what steps to take that lead to real change. Michelle.
Are you, maybe the caller is, or the writer is referring to when I said, you know, for white women, we need to lift up the voices of women of color and people of color. Perhaps that's what they're referring to.
Yes.
I think that this means listen more and talk less. You know, show up to participate and be prepared not to have the answers, but to learn the answers from other people, and then to utilize whatever platforms. For me, you know, I have a lot of people say, for example, I mean, this is very tiny, but who follow me on social media to make sure that I'm retweeting or re-amplifying the things that women of color are saying in the sexual violence arena. You know, I look for those, you know, tweets or posts by people who I know are working on that issue. And then I don't add my own content. I don't try to take their message and turn it into my message. I just amplify. So that's one very tiny, not very, you know, difficult example that everyone can do in their daily life. And then of course, yeah, there's others.
There's something else I would add, which is that I always recommend that people triage, first of all, and really say, what are the 1 or 2 issues on which you want to be a leader? You can support other people who are being leaders on the 25 other things you're upset about if you're like me and upset about 25 things, but you can't lead on 25 things. So pick the 1 or 2. And then if you're looking to lift up other voices and to provide, you know, help with justice issues, look for groups that are already doing the work, that have feet on the street in the area that you're interested in. And maybe if you're interested in lifting up the voices of women of color or trans women or whatever group it is, look for organizations led by the people most directly and personally affected, and support. That is another way to lift up, to support those organizations, to follow their lead, and to basically hand over the mic, hand over your dollars if you have them, hand over your time, you know, whatever it is, hand over your professional skills, which many organizations need help with. But you don't need to come in and reinvent the wheel or be a white savior or be a savior to anyone. You can come in and support the people who are working for their own liberation in order to achieve your liberation, which I know I'm quoting, as I'm forgetting who I'm quoting there, but that's a famous quote about, don't work for my liberation. We will only be liberated together.
Well, there is another question which I would say is partisan, but I'm going to ask so that we can shine a light on making sure we go out to vote. How can we ensure that vote by mail will be a reality across the entire United States versus only in the Democrat governor-led states, key to enabling voter turnout under the constraints of the COVID-19 shelter in place. And I would begin by saying our Registrar of Voters in Santa Clara County is part of our voter engagement work group under the Women's Equality Leadership Council. And we are encouraging everybody to stay safe and vote from home. And if you can get the word out about how people can do that, that would be incredible. We are asking everybody to consider ways in which you can be our champion, our ambassador in spreading the word about voting. I'm going to turn it over to Alicia and Michelle to answer, and then we can wrap up.
I guess I would say, first of all, how sad it is that we live in a time and under a government in which using the United States mail is partisan. That is appalling. I think we're very lucky to live in a place that has essentially universal, vote by mail and absentee balloting. There are organizations around the country in red states where this is not the case, and you can donate to those organizations, and maybe I'll make a list of those organizations that are promoting vote by mail in red states available to the organizers after, and they can distribute if they want. But I think you can also Google it. I think that, this is a dark time in our country. We're living under the most corrupt administration in modern history, maybe ever. Dangerous, corrupt administration. And I think everything that everyone can do to work on voter turnout, that has to be job one right now. That's what I'm spending my time doing, and I hope you will join me.
So there are some specific things I would recommend. Fair Fight is an organization led by Stacey Abrams. All on the Line is an organization led by former Attorney General Holder. They are focused specifically on fighting back against voter suppression. And so I think those are two organizations that not only can you donate to, but you can look to for guidance on actions. There are many, many people who are still not registered to vote, as much as it seems like we've all been focusing on turning out the vote. Organizations like Swing Left and Sister District and other organizations that help you send postcards and letters to people with voter registration applications and telling them why you vote and encouraging them to vote. I know personally, I've been a permanent absentee ballot voter for a long time, and this year, sometimes I mail it, sometimes I drop it off. I think this year I'm going to drop it off, and often I wait till the last minute. And I think this year I'm going to drop it off as early as I can. I mean, these are little tactics around our vote. I would also push back on voter depression and which is sort of instigated by misinformation and propaganda, where people think their votes don't matter. I think one of the reasons they try to make the vote uncertain is to discourage people from voting, to have people have a reason to say, my vote won't be counted, my vote won't matter. Or I live in a safe district, I live in a safe state, or, et cetera, et cetera. And I really, when I hear my friends give in to any kind of what I call voter depression, I push back so heavily, and I really focus on all the things that happen on your ballot, not just this year. Obviously, there are big things happening, but lots of things are happening on your ballot. Your vote does count. We do know that there are very, very, very tight races that happen all over the country, including in California, and don't listen to the people and wonder why. It's, you can say with voter suppression that our vote must be powerful if they're trying to pass laws to prevent us from voting. Well, I would ask the same thing about people who come out with voter depression tactics. Why do they want to make me think my vote doesn't matter? Why do they want to make me think it's all for naught? I mean, that's just a different angle on the same thing. And, I would push back on that too. I don't know if I think we're at our time. And so I just want to thank Michelle, first and foremost. It was great to have this conversation with you. I want to thank the Women's Equality Leadership Council and the Santa Clara County and the Office of Women's Policy. They made this possible. And I want to remind you, we have 2 more events coming. September 3rd is the next one, and that's going to be, although I think we've been a little bit call to action-y today. We didn't just set the table. We actually started to put out a bit of call to action, but we're going to dig even deeper into that on September 3rd. And so I encourage you all to join us. And, I just thank you all for being here. It was great to have such a big crowd during this pandemic. And when there's so many other things going on, I feel like I'm on 12 Zooms a day. So we really, really appreciate you. And thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank President Cindy Chavez and Supervisor Dave Cortese also for their help and support, and on the entire fantastic staff and of the Office of Women's Policy. We're so lucky to have an Office of Women's Policy in our county. We're so lucky to live in a place that values women and that wants to work to protect survivors, and all of the other wonderful participants from the League of Women Voters and the AAUW, both organizations that are close to my heart. So this was really a thrill for me to be able to participate, and especially with Elisa, somebody I admire so much. So thank you so much for including me in this fantastic event.
What an honor. Thank you, everybody. We will be sending in information about our other two events and Eventbrite survey. And yes, we'll make the recording available. But for a moment, I just want to say, let's savor the talent we have in our community. The call to action is to find talented people who can help us keep this fight going. With all of you who attended today and our amazing panelists, as well as each of our council members from the Women's Equality Leadership Council. It is my honor to also thank my coworker, Lisa Kim, Laura Kim, and I see, well, Cecilia's gone, Cecilia Carrillo, who have worked tirelessly to make this happen today. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you on September 3rd. Stay safe, wear your masks. Thank you, everyone.